we think about three broad categories of network effects: direct network effects, two-sided networks, and what we call hybrid networks, which, as the name suggests, is a combination of the two. And now I will say that, like everything in life, there's no black or white here, and there are shades of grey with how we categorise these. But generally speaking, we do categorise them into those three broad areas.
And there are subcategories of each, and maybe let's walk through those. So let's start with the direct network.
So when we think about direct network effects, it's very much around how homogeneous is the user base. If it's a homogeneous user base, then we think about it as a direct network. And when we think about these direct networks, we think about four different subcategories: peer-to-peer networks, marketplaces, freemium software, and they're classically freemium software business models, and finally, what we call customer acquisition and retention models. So a couple of examples of peer-to-peer networks: you use WhatsApp, perfect example of a peer-to-peer network in messaging. Another example would be Square's Cash App business, which is a peer-to-peer financial service. On the marketplace side of things, these examples are more obvious, but there is a nuance around here that we try to highlight. So the New York Stock Exchange we consider to be a direct network. Now, at a transactional level, there's a buyer and a seller classically on every side of a transaction, but the buyer or the seller is just as likely to be a buyer or a seller on the other side of a transaction in any given day. And so the user base is very much homogenous of the New York Stock Exchange.
And it's probably worth noting that many people would probably automatically jump to, that's a two-sided network. You have a buyer and a seller.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for us, and it's just a definitional thing, and it helps the way we think about how the network effects actually work. At a transactional level, yes, buyer or seller, but at a network effect level, the user is homogenous. So eBay is another example where certainly at the genesis of eBay, the users of eBay were generally speaking more homogenous. Now we're in a more grey area now with eBay, where there are some sellers on eBay that are never buyers, and like myself, I'm a buyer on eBay but never a seller. But generally speaking, we say that user base of eBay, the eBay marketplace, is homogenous. The third category are the freemium software business model. So a couple of examples here. If you've got a young kid, you've probably come across Fortnite, social gaming, where it's a free-to-play video game. The more users of the video game, the more utility for the users in the video game, and they monetize that with microtransactions within the game itself. Another example in the corporate software space is Slack, where you've got corporate software messaging platform. The more users, the more utility there is for that messaging platform, very much in the same way as WhatsApp, but it's monetized with a freemium software business model. The final one, where we have two of our portfolio companies, are really good examples here, is customer acquisition and retention, and how direct network effects can really drive that aspect of the business model. So Safety Culture and Culture Amp are two examples. If we take Culture Amp, so we think the global leader in software solution in organizational culture, they've developed, by virtue of all the users of their software, these wonderful benchmarks around organizational culture. And they've got dozens of benchmarks around different organization types, different demographics, different trying to understand different cultural aspects within a business. So if I'm thinking about what culture software solution to use, I'm going to be more attracted to using Culture Amp because of these rich culture benchmarks that they've developed by virtue of the thousands of customers that bend their information into them.
So that's direct networks. What about two-sided networks?
So as the name suggests, two very distinct sides, a demand side and the supply side. And how do we distinguish between the two? It's really which way does the money flow and which way do the goods and services flow. So the money flows from the demand side to the supply side. The goods and services flow from the supply side to the demand side. The network platform sits in the middle, and that is the business that reaps the benefit of the connectivity between the two.
So, Hamo, there are some nuances around two-sided network effects, and maybe it's best to illustrate those nuances through some examples, maybe.
Yeah, so some examples are open table, where you got diners on the demand side, you got restaurants on the supply side. Spotify, another portfolio company where you have listeners on the demand side and labels and musicians on the supply side. Another example would be Airbnb, where you've got people booking stays on the demand side. On the supply side, you have hosts that are providing the places to stay.
So, what about a Shopify, for instance?
The Shopify, more of a nuanced example where that started off as a software business and then developed network effects using, on the demand side, the merchants that use their software. They created a platform that they were then able to supply applications, value-added applications and features to their merchants. So there was a value-added functionality to their merchants on the demand side, the benefit for the apps on the supply side getting access to all those customers.
And I think we've probably forgotten the biggest one of all, and that's Google.
So Google, very much to us, a two-sided network where you have people that are searching for information on the demand side. On the supply side, you have advertisers.
Perfect. So this brings us to probably the most interesting of network effects, that being the hybrid network effect, and as it suggests, a combination of direct and two-sided. And maybe you can give a bit more color around exactly how this looks.
Okay, yeah, so direct network effects have a baby with two-sided network effects, and you get the hybrid network. On the demand side, you have direct network effects. On the supply side, you have supplies to the demand side. So that's the general concept. Classic examples are social networks. So we would say that Facebook and Twitter are hybrid network. Have hybrid network effects as a key part of their business model, or as a fundamental part of their business model.
Peer-to-peer social aspect, the more users on Facebook, the greater utility for every user.
Great example, and they monetize that direct network by supplying advertising to those users on the demand side.
And obviously, the more demand you have and the greater the network effect, the more likely the supply gets sucked in, and they feed each other in that sense.
Exactly, and that's why these are such super powerful business models, because you've got the power of the two network effects. You've got the power of the direct network effects on the demand side, and then you have the power of the two-sided network as the two interact.
And we'll come back to the power of this network, and we'll come back to the power of all the networks, because it's interesting to compare and contrast. But there are three different types of hybrid networks, so I think it's probably worth going through each of those.
Yeah, so we think about the three different types. So you've got social networks like Facebook and Twitter. You've got content-based networks, and classically user-generated content networks. So two good examples, Pinterest and YouTube, where, so take YouTube for example, you've got huge user-generated content and direct network effects around that on the demand side, and you have the supply of advertising, likewise with Pinterest.
And the third?
The third example are what we call dual monetized network effects. Again, super powerful. Classic example is LinkedIn, where on the demand side, you've got LinkedIn users, where you've got a freemium software business model. Yes, you can use LinkedIn for free, but if you pay to be a premium user, you get value-added functionality. So the demand side is getting monetized, whereas the previous examples we used, it's classically free for the demand side. They also monetize the network on the supply side. So, recruiters pay to access the LinkedIn platform for their recruiting business. And so that is the supply, that is how they monetize, one example of how they monetize the supply side.
And advertisers would be another example on the supply side.
Exactly.